Smoke rolled above the prison yard like a grey cloud trapped behind high walls. Men shouted from every side. Some stood on broken tables. Some waved shirts in the air. Some held signs made from torn cardboard. And at the center of the yard inside Attica Correctional Facility, frightened correctional officers were surrounded by hundreds of inmates. One officer, Thomas Reed, had his hands tied behind him with strips torn from prison clothing. His face was pale, his breathing fast, his eyes fixed on the guard tower above, where armed officers watched but did not fire. Nobody in the yard knew what would happen next. For 4 long days, control of part of one of America's most feared prisons had changed hands. Now the loudest sound came from a helicopter circling above. Its blades chopped the cold air. Every face turned upward. Some inmates believed officials were finally bringing food and medicine. Others feared something much worse. At the front of the crowd stood an inmate named Daniel Harper, holding a handwritten list of demands in shaking hands. He looked toward the prison wall where state officials had gathered outside the fence. He shouted, "We want the world to hear what is happening in here." His voice cracked but carried. Because for days, the prison had become something nobody thought possible. The men inside had forced America to look through the bars. Behind Daniel stood dozens of inmates gathered around the hostages, trying to keep order in a place built on punishment and fear. Not all the prisoners agreed. Not all trusted each other. Some wanted peace. Some wanted revenge. Some simply wanted to survive. Then something dropped from the helicopter. Not food. Not medicine. A white cloud burst in the yard. Gas spread fast. Men coughed. Eyes burned. Shouts became screams. Officer Thomas Reed dropped to his knees, unable to see. Daniel Harper covered his mouth and looked toward the prison wall. Then he saw dark figures rushing through the smoke. State troopers. Helmets. Weapons raised. The yard exploded into panic. And just before the first line of troopers reached the gate, Daniel turned and saw one of the hostages fall beside him. He could not tell if the man had slipped, been struck, or worse. Smoke covered everything. The shouting grew louder than ever. And in that terrible moment, nobody in the yard knew who would still be standing when the smoke cleared. 4 days earlier, Attica Correctional Facility looked cold and quiet under the September sky. The prison sat surrounded by farmland in Attica, with long walls, steel gates, and towers that watched every movement. Inside, life followed rules that rarely changed. Wake up early. Count. Breakfast. Work. Lock in. Count again. For many inmates, every day felt the same. Concrete walls. Metal bars. Harsh voices. Long silence. The prison held more than 2,000 inmates, many far from home, many sharing crowded cells, many carrying anger they rarely showed openly. Officer Thomas Reed had worked there 6 years. He knew most men by face, even if not by name. He also knew the mood had changed in recent months. Small complaints had become louder. Food portions were smaller. Mail arrived late. Medical requests took too long. And many inmates said basic needs were ignored. Thomas noticed it in the dining hall first. The room looked normal, but voices stayed lower than usual. Too quiet often meant trouble. He walked past one table where Daniel Harper sat with 2 other inmates. Daniel was serving time for armed robbery. He was 32, tall, careful with words, and known for staying out of fights. Yet lately he had begun speaking more. Not loudly, but often. Thomas heard one sentence as he passed. "They think silence means peace." The inmate beside Daniel whispered, "Keep your voice down." Daniel looked at his tray. Keeping quiet got us nowhere. Thomas kept walking but remembered that line. Later that morning, inmates returned to their cells for count. Cell blocks closed one after another. Metal doors slammed in rhythm. Inside one block, inmate Robert Lane tapped quietly on his bars. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. A nearby inmate answered. Officers often ignored tapping unless it became loud. But small signals traveled through old prisons. That afternoon, Thomas attended staff briefing. A supervisor reminded officers that rumors were spreading. Possible protest. Possible refusal of work. Possible trouble in one housing area. Stay alert, the supervisor said. Nothing moves unless we control it. But prisons often held more emotion than reports could show. That evening, Daniel Harper wrote on folded paper at his cell desk. A list. Not hidden. Not illegal. Just sentences. Better medical care. More family visits. Basic supplies. Fair treatment. When another inmate passed near his cell, Daniel slid the paper under a book. Not because writing demands was forbidden, but because timing mattered. The next morning began badly. Breakfast arrived late. A kitchen delay. Trays came cold. Some inmates complained. An officer snapped back. Words turned sharper. One tray hit the floor. Then silence returned. But not calm silence. Tight silence. Thomas Reed noticed several inmates exchanging glances during movement. Not panic. Not fear. More like agreement. At noon, one inmate refused to return to his cell after recreation. Officers moved in quickly. The inmate obeyed after warning. Small incident. Yet small incidents inside prison often mattered more than they looked. That night, rain hit the prison windows. Water tapped metal frames. Inside his cell, Daniel Harper spoke softly through bars to Robert Lane across the row. Tomorrow morning, Daniel said. Robert looked uneasy. You sure? No, Daniel answered honestly. But waiting keeps changing nothing. Robert asked, and if it goes wrong? Daniel stared at the ceiling. It already is wrong. Thomas Reed slept poorly that night at home. His wife noticed. You thinking about work again? He nodded. Feels tense. Maybe it passes, she said. He wanted to believe that. Before sunrise he drove back through dark roads toward the prison. Fog sat low across fields. The towers appeared slowly ahead. Cold. Still. Ordinary from outside. Inside, count began. Then breakfast. Then movement. At first everything looked normal. But near one narrow corridor, an officer ordered inmates to line up faster. One inmate stumbled. Another turned. Someone shouted. Then another officer pushed forward. A gate jammed halfway. For 1 second, the movement pattern broke. And in prison, one broken second could become something huge. Daniel Harper saw it happen. A gate not fully closed. An officer distracted. 2 inmates moving where they should not. Then shouting. A prisoner ran through the opening. Another followed. Officer Thomas Reed turned at once. Stop! But too many voices rose together. Someone grabbed the gate. Someone else pushed. Metal slammed against concrete. The corridor filled with motion. Thomas tried reaching the control lever but bodies pressed everywhere. He heard another officer yelling for backup. Then a loud crash. A door lock failed under pressure. Inmates spilled into a larger section. Thomas stumbled backward. Hands grabbed his arm. He tried to pull free. Another hand took his radio. For a second he thought he would fall hard to the floor. Instead someone held him upright. Daniel Harper stood there. Don't make this worse, Daniel said. Thomas stared. The corridor behind them had become chaos. Doors slammed. Voices shouted from every side. Some inmates ran. Some froze. Some watched in disbelief. Daniel pulled Thomas toward the yard entrance. Move. Thomas realized quickly Daniel was not striking him. He was protecting him from the crush. But why? By the time they reached the yard, hundreds had already flooded into the open area. Word spread faster than officers could stop it. The prison section had broken. Men climbed fences inside the yard. Others shouted demands. Some officers were captured, disarmed, surrounded, but not attacked. Daniel climbed onto a bench and raised both arms. Listen. At first nobody listened. Then slowly voices lowered. We keep control or we lose everything, Daniel shouted. Robert Lane stood nearby, breathing hard. More officers are coming. Daniel nodded. I know. Thomas Reed sat on the ground now, wrists tied loosely with cloth strips. Another hostage officer sat beside him, equally stunned. One inmate offered Thomas water. He refused at first, then accepted, because everything happening felt unreal. By noon, prison officials outside the wall had begun negotiations. State representatives arrived. Reporters gathered outside. For the first time, cameras pointed toward Attica not because of routine prison news, but because something historic had begun. Inside the yard, Daniel held his folded paper again. Now it mattered. A list made in silence had become words shouted across walls. Hours passed. Food grew short. Tempers rose and fell. Some inmates argued loudly. Others wanted immediate surrender. Others believed surrender would bring punishment anyway. Thomas watched Daniel move from group to group, calming voices. That surprised him, because Daniel looked less like a rioter and more like someone trying to stop panic. By evening, rain returned lightly. The yard smelled of wet concrete and fear. Officials outside promised talks in the morning. Inside, inmates built makeshift shelters from tables and blankets. Hostages sat together under watch. Nobody slept much. Thomas stayed awake listening. At one point Robert Lane sat near him. "You think they'll listen?" Thomas asked quietly. Robert gave a tired smile. They never listened before. Morning came grey and cold. More officials arrived. Religious leaders. Observers. People sent to hear demands. Daniel read from the paper through the fence. His hands shook but his voice stayed steady. Requests for humane treatment. Requests for fair rules. Requests for change. Outside the wall, officials listened but gave few answers. Inside, hope rose and fell every hour. Thomas noticed something dangerous by afternoon. Different groups of inmates were starting to disagree more openly. One group wanted patience. Another group wanted stronger pressure. A third trusted nobody outside. Daniel kept moving, speaking, calming. But the prison yard was growing harder to control. Late that evening, a rumor spread fast. Troopers were gathering. Weapons arriving. Gas equipment being unloaded. Nobody knew if it was true. But rumors inside prison moved like sparks near dry wood. Thomas heard shouting near the far side of the yard. Two inmate groups arguing. Daniel ran there. For several minutes voices rose. Then settled. Barely. Night came colder. The helicopter sound began far away after midnight. Very faint. Some men looked up. Others ignored it. Daniel did not ignore it. He stood still, listening. Then looked toward the wall. The next morning officials returned with fewer words than before. That frightened him more than shouting would have. Thomas Reed saw it too. Outside the wall, faces looked harder now. Less patient. More decided. Then one officer in the tower suddenly moved fast and shouted something down the line. Daniel turned toward the sky. The helicopter sound was back. Louder now. Closer. And as the first shadow crossed the prison yard, someone near the fence screamed. "They're coming in now."